Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, professors, activists, mostly professors from any university in America, left coast, west coast, east coast, center of America, conservative, liberal, economists, sociologists, political science professors, whatever you want to call it. We want to provide their information and their perspective to you, unedited and unaltered, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. It is my privilege to have back Professor Ryan Griffiths. You were one of my very first interviews ever. I really appreciate you coming back. It is a privilege. Ryan Griffiths is professor of political science department at Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. We'll be discussing the article he wrote, "Sometimes Secession Works, Why It Won't Work for the U.S." in the Hill magazine, written in 2023. We're also going to be discussing a new book, working title, American Secession, The Folly of a Red State, Blue State Divorce. First, let's learn a little bit about the professor. He's at Syracuse University. He's the research co-director for the International and Interstate Conflict Program, senior research associate for the Program for Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration. So a lot of experience in this. He teaches topics on nationalism and world politics, theories of nationalism, international relations, orders and change in international relations, revolutions in U.S. foreign policy. He focuses on the dynamics of secession and the study of sovereignty, state systems, and international orders. He teaches a variety of courses from revolution to international order. His most recent book is titled Secession and the Sovereignty Game, Strategy and Tactics for Aspiring Nations, from Cornell University Press, 2021. Previously taught at both the University of Sydney in Australia and at Johns Hopkins University, very famous university. He also served as a visiting assistant professor at the Barcelona Institute for International Studies, visiting fellow at Yale University's Macmillan Center. He earned a PhD in international relations and comparative politics at Columbia University in 2010. And Columbia is one of the top universities for that. He's a professor in the Department of Political Science at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He focuses on secession and the study of sovereignty and state systems. We've already covered that. Some of the books he's written: Secession and the Sovereignty Game, Strategy and Tactics for Aspiring Nations; The Age of Secession, The International and Domestic Determinants of State Birth. Some journal articles: Are Secessionists Making the Right Arguments for Independence? Toward a Theory of Heteronomy, Der Drang zum Eigenstaat, Local Conditions and the Demand for Independence, Secession Strategy and Tactical Variation, The Pursuit of Independence, War, Interaction Capacity, and the Structures of State Systems, States and Their International Relations. So a lot of international relations background and a lot of experience studying secession movements around the world. Here's some of the various academic positions: Syracuse University, the Hertie School, Center for International Security, University of Sydney, Barcelona, Yale, and Johns Hopkins. Bachelor in philosophy from UC Berkeley, great school, and then Columbia. And this is the article that the professor wrote. We'll get into that. It's somewhat related to the new book, not completely. But first, let's check in. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Did I get anything incorrect about the background? Is there something we need to correct?
No, that is, you did a great job. Thank you for the very kind and generous introduction, Marcus. And let me just say, it's very nice to be back chatting with you. I always enjoy our conversations, and I learn as much from them as I hope you learn from them. So thank you.
You are a master in this field. You're very well educated, and most importantly, I'm glad that you're carrying the conversation to a public space. So you're writing books, you're studying this, and then you're also trying to get that information out to the lay public, like the Hill article. And I find it very informative and detailed, more than the media typically does when they discuss this. You know, they're kind of like, oh, that's bad and wrong, and you actually break it down. First, what is the book about, and how much can you talk to us about American Secession, the Folly of a Red State, Blue State Divorce? And then we'll go into the article.
Sure. So the book, so it's a work in progress. I'm hoping to have a full draft this summer and have it out at some point early next year with a little luck. So the book, actually grew out of the article that you're talking about here that I wrote for The Hill last year. And that article was an interesting development. I was invited to do it by my media department, and I enjoyed writing that op-ed. I don't always enjoy writing op-eds because they're hard to write, and sometimes you work really hard on one and it doesn't land. But that one I very much enjoyed, and then it inspired me to write this book. All right, so the book, in broad strokes, it looks at an argument that I think, and I think you feel the same, is becoming a bit more common in the American, in America, which is that maybe there should be some sort of national divorce between what we'll call blue America and red America. And, just as a shorthand, that would produce, we'll say 2 countries, red land and blue land, right? It can get far more complicated than that. But let's just go with that for a second. And as you can see here, there's the photo of Marjorie Taylor Greene, because the article from last year was responding to a tweet she made in February, which was that, hey, look, it's not working anymore. It's time to have a red state, blue state divorce. She was obviously supportive of the red state side. She made a more recent tweet about that earlier this year, 2024. So what the book does, it's very simple, really, is that it says, all right, let's consider the implications of doing this. All right. And one of the things I'm not trying to do in the book is to quibble with people's feelings about polarization, or to take on arguments made by the right or the left about who's right or anything like that. Rather, just to accept, look, there is polarization in the United States. And a few people doubt that. But then all right, let's walk through the implications of a call for a red state, blue state divorce and what that would mean. And here, what I'm trying to do is bring in my background and experience, which is to, study secessionism as a phenomenon around the world and over time, and then take the lessons learned there and apply it to the case of the United States. All right. And in doing so, I do make an argument in it, which is, initially I give the arguments that you would see for that kind of division. I give them plenty of airtime. I try to give them a robust and honest, argument. And then I walk through the problems that would follow from it. And in a nonpartisan way, say, this is a very difficult thing to pull off. And it would almost certainly lead to some sort of cascade or basically a lot of bloodshed and a lot of violence and a lot of turmoil. And it's a path that I think people need to reconsider. So if I were just to summarize, I would say a point of the book is to try to disabuse people of the notion that secession is an easy solution to polarization. It's in fact, at best, a last resort solution, and sometimes it may not even be that.
So you're looking at kind of Civil War style, if we split into 2 full separate nations. This isn't exactly like if Texas by itself wanted to leave and the rest of America stayed intact. This is all the conservatives leaving, all the liberals leaving. You'd have massive chaos if you tried to split a population of 300 million apart in half.
That's right. So let me make a basic distinction here between what we'll call a red state, blue state divorce, right? And something like Texan or Californian independence, all right? Let me deal with the second category in a second. But the first one is the one I'm aiming at, which is this idea that we can divide America into, red land and blue land. And for reasons that you've sort of alluded to already, I don't think that's possible. Secession, when it works, generally works when you've got a very distinct and regionally concentrated nation. And they can be distinct for a set of reasons, maybe language or race or religion, all kinds of things. But they're regionally concentrated, ideally some sort of border that separates them from other regions so people can easily agree upon where the border should be drawn. And then ideally some sort of special administrative status for that region, okay? And if we think about red and blue America, none of those things hold. right? I think in one of the previous interviews I had with you, I talked about where I live. I live in a purple suburb of Syracuse. I have neighbors who are Republican, Democrat, Independent. We don't even know sometimes, but it doesn't matter. We all get along. There are households that are divided. And if you tried to get into the business of dividing America into red and blue, you're not only going to divide communities, you're often going to divide houses and bedrooms. So you would then have to figure out a way to unsort those populations or draw some sort of very complicated map that nicely sorts the different people, into red land and blue land. And all of that is very complicated, as you can imagine. And one of the things I do in the book is walk through systematically the different perils that would follow, right? And here I borrow stuff from political science about polarization and ideological hardening. Then what follows from that: unmixing, cleansing, security dilemmas that result, populations on the run, refugee crises, vital land grabs, all kinds of things you could imagine. And civil war would certainly follow from that. So that's the project. Now that's different from the project that I know you're involved in California or in Texas or other regional movements. I think those are also very difficult things to pull off. But the book is primarily aimed at this idea of a national divorce along red and blue lines, which is, I used to think is a far-fetched thing, and maybe it hopefully still is, but it is something that you hear a bit more and more. And by the way, we have a divisive election coming later in this year. And sometimes, sometimes these arguments can be picked up in the context of a lot of turmoil.
Okay, a couple questions to get started. You already answered this, but just to be clear for the audience, political polarization is real and it's bad. It's not little bit bad. It's not, it's fine, we'll get over it. It's significantly bad. Would you agree to that?
I would. So I think polarization is at a very high point in America. I don't disagree with that at all. And it's not something I disagree with in the book at all. I would hasten to point out here, though, that polarization, like you and I, we could get in a van and drive around the country and visit different places. And that'd be a lot of fun, by the way.
Yeah.
But we might have different interpretations about the severity of that polarization, right? You and I could look at the same facts just as many Americans could. And as you know, people on the right side of the political spectrum, on the opposite side from you, may look at the same facts and see them very differently. And that's just something that happens. I don't see polarization in America as a runaway train that will inevitably get worse and worse and lead to some sort of bad future. But arguing whether or not I'm wrong on that is very difficult, because it comes down to how much we feel the danger of that polarization. But I'll say in general, there's no question. The fact that we're here and considering these issues, and the fact that it's an election coming up that is I get butterflies. I get nervous thinking about it. That's a sign of the polarization that I see and feel.
Trump versus Biden a second time. What could go wrong? I mean, so I want to say this artfully. Marjorie Taylor Greene, when I've interviewed other professors, is seen as somebody who's not a great spokesperson. She talked about Jewish space lasers, so that kind of hurt her reputation. But I've also heard, she's not wrong when she says that things are kind of bad, like the level of division is bad. In her stance, she says we need to have a full red and blue, total two separate nations. And she didn't explain that well. I watched her interview with Hannity. Even with her coaching her, she still didn't explain it very well. It was kind of a patchwork idea. But her stance was that things are going to continue to get bad, and this is the way that we prevent a civil war. How do we know that things definitely won't get worse and that we won't have one scenario I brought up to people, some professors who were experts in calming down political polarization, was they said, okay, let's say you have the perfect solution to political polarization. We're going to educate the public. We're going to institute moderate voters. We'll have Australia-style voting. We'll have Congress members hug and kiss each other before they even go to their separate, whatever you want to call it. What if it takes 5 years to get that up and off the ground for a population of 300 million, like to get people into doing it, making this happen? And we have 5 more January 6th in that in-between time. So while we found the right solution, we're working towards it, but it's a population of 300 million people. It's not going to happen in a day. It's going to be a 5 to 10 year project. That's what I'm hearing. How do we know that America can survive 5 more January 6th before the time that we have, things healed up?
It's a good question. We don't know that it can survive that. There is a breaking point. It's like the question of national debt, right? At what point is the U.S. debt? We know that there's some point, but people disagree about when that could happen. It's the same kind of thing when we consider what's the breaking point for U.S. law and order. I tend to think that it's and again, these are questions that people can't answer, right? Because they come down to just your sort of opinion on it.
Right. Totally agree.
I tend to think it is that the U.S. government is robust. It is very robust. It can break. And look, in the long run, I mean, by that I mean like we're talking centuries. It will break, right? Things will change, and as Keynes said, we're all dead in the long run, right?
Sure.
So it will break. I don't know how much it takes to break it, but I also don't know how many more, storming of the Capitol buildings we're likely to see. It might be that, in another 10 years, we'll get together on an interview like this and we'll think, well, things kind of smoothed out, right? And and whatever, the right constellation of factors came together. You had a realignment in political parties. You had new rules put into place to try to create more moderate districts, all kinds of things that you're familiar with. That could all happen. Conversely, there may be another universe where you and I get together in 10 years and we're living in different countries because New York is now a different country. Or maybe we're both part of Blue Land because I live in New York.
I love the way you said that because I'm a Marvel fan. So different universes. But I think that perfectly encapsulated. Like, we don't know. You're right. We're getting into what happens next year and then 2 years and 3 and 4, 5, 6 years from now. That's impossible to know. You can take intelligent guesses, but okay. So it might get better. It might get worse. What were your main arguments for why a full break national secession like Marjorie's talking about? Well, first, before I ask you that, I just, as a personal question, your personal opinion as a professor, but also as an American, is Marjorie Taylor Greene, let's say her solution is wrong and the way she presented it was inartful and confusing. Is she wrong for broaching this topic, for saying, wow, things are really bad, we should have that kind of conversation of where this goes? Is she wrong for broaching that?
So this is more, you asked my personal opinion.
Personal opinion.
I think she is. I think, okay. and I think for two reasons. Well, it's actually really just one big reason. One is that she is an elected official. Okay. And, if you're an elected official of the United States government, I do think you have certain responsibilities about what you say and do, right? Somebody could say that, and I think in some of the responses to her tweet in 2023, some people called it treasonous, that sort of thing. Those are strong words, but nevertheless, I'll just go with irresponsible. All right. Because you're working for an institution and then you're proposing that it be broken up, and if you did that for a company, right, for a private organization, they would probably fire you, right? You're working for us, you're getting paid by us. And now you're saying to other people in these side conversations, we should really break this company up. Right. So I think that, but I think it's also irresponsible in another way, which is that, and this is a theme in the book, right? Most people, and this comes out of experience interviewing secessionists in different places around the world, typically in much more developed secessionist regions like Catalonia or Kurdistan or Scotland, things like that, people almost never know, even the leaders, they really never have a full understanding of what that path entails. It becomes very theoretical. It becomes based on a good deal of wishful thinking. So they'll throw the arguments out, but how it really works is kind of it's like a dark room that you're entering into. Okay. And I think if somebody in a position in a position like hers, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, where people listen to you, you're an elected official, you have a large audience, to say that you can normalize that conversation, you can normalize that language. People begin to think that this is a very realistic option when they may not really know much about what follows from it. And that's not because they're ignorant. It's just because people generally don't know. And that is a big part of what I'm trying to do in the book, which is to say, let's be careful with what we say here. This is there's a lot at stake in how this works. It's very complicated and a very perilous process.
And of course, you had mentioned that there were conditions where secession seemed to work, but regionally concentrated, recognized border, some sort of special administrative status, and a lot of those missing here. Okay. What are the main well, first, and also just to back you up, Professor Bridget Coggins from University of California, Santa Barbara, wrote a book on international recognition. And she basically said what you said, that it's there's kind of rules, but really when you look at it, it's, that Russia decided to recognize a country, America decided to recognize a country, Germany decided to recognize a country. It sort of fits, sort of doesn't. It's, basically, she said, get a superpower on your side if you want to become a country. Because then they can just push it through. Anyways, what are the main arguments? What are the main pitfalls? And if you could maybe answer as not just a professor, but as a sympathetic American.
Okay.
Now, I understand you think if we split red and blue apart, we'll get X. But when you really think about it, you're going to end up with Y. I know that you think this might help your kids, but really, if you think about it, your kids are going to suffer from X, Y, Z. What do people think is going to happen? In your opinion as an American, and then in your professional opinion as a professor, why do you think that's wrong? Like, what are they thinking? Oh, this is the easiest, right? Because people are attracted to this discussion. They're attracted to this idea. I think you're saying they're not fully informed of the consequences of it, but what is it that attracts them to this? What is it they think is going to magically happen? And what are the major things they're getting wrong in their thinking?
Okay. All right. So there's a few different ways to answer that, and I'll do my best.
Sorry to load.
No, it's okay. No, not at all. So it's not that I think people. It's one little caveat. It's not that I think that people I talk to who support these things are wrong, right? I think that honestly, anybody I've talked to who's involved with the regional movement or red state or blue state, they're all reasonable people. I enjoy talking to them. It's always a respectful conversation. Like I don't. And everybody's certainly intelligent, and they're not wrong. I just think that there's a larger story about how secession works that is absent from a lot of these conversations. That's all. But I think so. If I were to try to, summarize the basic arguments, and this is how I'm working through it in the book. I tend to think of it as three large categories. Okay, the biggest one and the most important one is what I will call irreconcilable differences. All right. The argument of irreconcilable differences. And yes, when I talk about it in the book, I do reference the 1980s Drew Barrymore movie where the parents and the child had irreconcilable differences. So divorce was the solution.
Yeah.
But and that argument is very simple. And it's just that you have people on each side, and maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene is voicing this sentiment that, look, people on the liberal side they control too much politics. They're pushing through policies that I disagree with, liberal policies, and they're blocking the development of the America I want to live with. We have differences of opinion and they cannot be reconciled. The mirror image is maybe on a more liberal side, the repeal of Roe v. Wade, the blocking of progressive policies. It's blocking the ability of the governmental institutions of America to produce a life that we all want to live, right? And a life of progress. And if you've got this kind of block because of differences in opinion and ideology, and it cannot be worked out, like, you know, I'll use the analogy of marital divorce. It's not a perfect analogy, but sometimes it's convenient. You know, like two people in a marriage who no longer love each other and can't work through their issues, going their separate way may be the best solution, right? And so that, I think, I call this the master argument for blue state, red state secession. A lot of it is based on sentiment. Obviously, it varies across the spectrum. It's the people on the wings that feel it the most. You know, people who are more moderate might be like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like a big deal to me, you know, and et cetera. But it's that basic argument. Now, it breaks down into smaller points about specific issue areas and maybe electoral politics and rich states versus poor states, rural versus urban, that kind of thing. But I would sum it up by saying that, you know, you can have this argument that the system is broken and the other side is stopping my side from living the way we want to live, a life of progress and meaning. Okay. And I'm very sympathetic to that. Like, and I do not mean to say to people who feel that way that you're wrong. That's certainly not the thing, right? I think that's the master argument. The two other arguments are, one is that it's a legal argument that there is a right to secession in America. All right. And I work through that and basically say that, you know, so for instance, this came out when Nikki Haley was still in the running for,
that's right,
for the Republican nomination. And she got caught saying, well, what about if Texas wants to secede? And she says something to, I'm paraphrasing here, they have that right, of course. A couple of days later on CNN, they kind of tried to pin her on that. Do they have that right? And she said, well, no, not constitutionally, but people need to pay attention to Texan concerns. So she was kind of equivocating there. So, and sometimes you talk to individuals who are pro-secessionist or pro-red state or blue state, and they might believe that that right is a decided thing or it's a constitutional right. One of the things I do in the book is say that is not at all the case. However, it's complicated. It's also not the case that everybody agrees that there is no constitutional right to secession. Most of the legal field thinks or tends to believe that that was settled in the Texas v. White Supreme Court case after the Civil War. But there is a strong minority view who disagrees with that for various reasons that get kind of technical. So yeah, I spend time talking about the legal argument, but also blow it up into a larger thing to say that, you know, you can go round and around on whether a group or people has a right to secession, but ultimately it's a very political, right? It's a political act, and it becomes active. It becomes important in the context of polarization, in the context of irreconcilable differences. The reason we're talking about it right now isn't because we're all living a happy life and singing.
Right.
No, it's because there's polarization. So it becomes an active debate in that moment. But if trying to disentangle America through secession is the project, that's a political project. And in my mind, it showcases the dangers of trying to act this out, whether or not you believe you have that right. It's more of a political decision that falls prey to ultimately political consequences, right? Anyway, that's a mouthful. The third argument I make is also dependent on irreconcilable differences. Sometimes you see people making the argument, smaller political units is better.
Right.
You bring the politics closer to the individual. And I'm sympathetic to all these arguments, but then I also talk about how there's problems with that as well. And ultimately, that is an argument that only really becomes active in the context of strong polarization and irreconcilable differences. So I work through all of those, but the main point I try to do is just say, all right, let's take this seriously, and then walk through how it would work out with a red state, blue state divorce, and talk about all the problems that follow from it and the disintegration, etc. It would look a lot like, well, I was about to say it'd look a lot like the movie Civil War. That's not.
I was going to ask you if you've, Have you seen it?
True. It wouldn't look just like that, but nevertheless, the kind of arresting and very upsetting violence that you see there would likely follow from an attempt to split America in two in this way.
I always, when I have these conversations with people about political polarization, they obviously always bring up the Civil War and how horrible it was. And I always bring up, we didn't just jump into the Civil War. There was this thing called Bleeding Kansas. And it was like 5 to 10 years before. And it was people in the South and the North reading newspaper reports of somebody walks up and just shoots someone in the face because they're like, oh, you're a slave owner. I'm a free stater. And just years of this kind of low level Italian years of lead type violence that went on for years before we ever had Bull Run. And I constantly remind people, we didn't just jump into full-scale armies. We had 5 to 10 years of newspaper headlines across America saying, these people are literally killing you in the streets and nothing's being done to stop it. And I wonder, if you see violence up and down, would that prep you to do something extreme? And then I wonder if we had that again. What if we had Bleeding Kansas, but this time it was televised, right? So it's not newspaper scripts, it's live video. Someone with a red badge on their thing walks up and you see them gun down a family of people who are in blue. I remember when they showed the George Floyd video, this country lost its cool immediately after that video released. I'm wondering if we had a Bleeding Kansas period, if people wouldn't lose it very quickly and we could find ourselves in a situation we never possibly imagined before, simply because it's televised violence on a mass scale. I mean, picture 100 Americans shooting down another 100 Americans and the whole thing's televised. I hope that never happens, but we're getting to the point where we have the technology, smartphones, and something like that could happen. When that happened last time, it precipitated the Civil War, it prepped people for it. I'm worried about that. To get back at what you're saying, irreconcilable differences, there is a right to secession, smaller political units is better. I've heard the smaller political units is better. That's an old, smaller is beautiful, or the beautiful is smaller. So it's an old concept. Why? But then you also have, I think there was a book called The Size of Nations by Enrico Sperliorio or some Italian researchers, and they were saying, there's kind of a average size of nation, something like France or Germany. And when you get to China, Brazil, Russia, America, they're off the charts in size. Is there an argument there? Most of the around 200 nations are not gigantic swaths the size of Russia, China, Brazil, India, and America. That's kind of rare. Is a much larger political unit less stable, or is there nothing to that?
Yeah, so that's that argument that so there's a book called American Secession by F.H. Buckley. You probably
read that. I mentioned it.
You are mentioned in it. That's right. And and probably the main thesis that Buckley's offering is that bigness is badness. He basically walks through all the problems with big countries and says why smaller countries are better. So there is, I'll put it like this, there is a kind of more public-facing argument about this. But then there's also a very rich and very technical academic literature, mostly by economists, and Buckley's partly referencing that in the background by people like you that you mentioned, like Alesina and Spolare, right?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Right. And so what they basically say is, look, you can think of a trade-off in terms of the size of a country, right? Being a big state or country can be helpful because, bigger countries have bigger armies. So they have bigger economies, national economies of scale. So that's the benefit. Of course, being a small state means they use some more economistic language, but it all boils down to the average voter preference is closer to what decision makers want because you just don't have as much variation in preferences across a district.
Right.
And then they talk about how different international factors basically shift the optimal size of states. Again, and these are economists thinking through this. They don't necessarily say that a country like the United States is too big, though, in that literature, for the most part, because one of the things they say is you can have a big country, but once it has a federal structure, then it can kind of have it both ways, because you can create smaller political units, second order units that can, work out some of their more immediate policy decisions, and then let the bigger decisions happen at the national level, and still have the big army and the big economy of scale, that kind of stuff. I don't know what they would have said about China or the Soviet Union. They might have been skeptical, but I don't know. I don't recall what they said there.
And to back up what you're saying, Russia and Brazil have a lot of regional autonomy districts where they're like, you govern you. We have a couple rules, but we don't want to be up in everybody's business. And I think maybe I know China sort of says they do. Tibet's sort of whatever. But that would be some way of doing sort of like a federalism thing. I remember I was shocked to find that out. So there really isn't an argument that smaller is automatically better. We can't say across the board, just looking at every single argument, smaller is automatically better. It's debatable, and there's arguments that bigger could be better. Is that fair?
Yeah, I do think it is debatable. I do think it's debatable, but 2 points. One is that doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic to those who, sometimes wish, whether on a regional level or a state level, that they could make more local decisions and not have a governor in the capital of that state or the federal government make decisions. I think that's part of the story of America, though, right? Is trying to balance the large governmental policies versus local policies. And that's a work in progress. And so, here comes my sort of more optimistic view of it. I see it as a work in progress. It's not perfect, but there's no government that's perfect, right? And it's trying to work through these structures. On the other hand, the smaller is better. I mean, that only goes so far, right? And, and there is a problem of, secession, and this gets at the larger project I have of trying to say how secession works. It's often recursive, meaning that, one group tries to secede and then groups within it try to secede, and they can still make the argument smaller. So Texas secedes, then then Austin says, well, we don't want to be part of Texas. We want to be the Republic of Austin. And that sounds good. And they say smaller is better. But then some suburb within Austin, that's more Republican says, well, we don't want to be part of the Republic of Austin. Smaller is better. And so you've got these complicated issues, and those are not costless transitions. They're expensive and difficult, and they can change people's lives and sometimes ruin them. So there's a lot at stake, I think.
So what are we know what the categories of thought, why people are attracted to this idea. What are the major pitfalls? Hey, I just heard we should split America into 2 countries. You just ran into me and we're in the elevator. What would you tell me? I'm a total stranger. I barely know you, but you're like, whoa, you're really backing this idea of just splitting America into 2? My God, did you think of X, Y, Z? What would be the first 3 things you would say to that person to let them know, man, there's some real pitfalls here you may not have thought about, respectfully? Like, what are the top 3 things that pop in your head? They're not thinking of this, and they're not thinking of that, and they probably haven't imagined that this isn't going to work. Top 3 or 5.
Top 3.
Listing.
Yeah. I mean, top 3, just to boil it down off the top of my head, would be, how are we going to draw these borders? How's that going to work? How are we going to do it in a way that lets every person be in the country that they're supposed to be in, right? Which is the purpose behind it in the first place. And then third, how do we do all of that without making for a lot of very miserable people and preventing violence, right? In that unsorting process. All right. I mean, I can give a slightly more detailed, like one of the things I do in the book is try to work through, I call them the perils of American divorce, right? And, one of them is the first one up front. I call it polarization and ideological hardening. And you can imagine that, let's say for a second, I mean, you live in Fresno, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So let's say that, all right, let's say there's a national convention is called, to figure out how to create red land and blue land. All right. They're going to have to work through different models for doing this. Right.
Okay.
And, the prime candidates for blueprints, right? The first one they'll start with, well, I don't know if they'll start with it, but it'll come up is, well, we'll just go to the last presidential election. We'll look at which states,
right,
Republican, which one Democrat. That's blueprint number one. All right. Put that over here for a second. Blueprint number two, because maybe some person might say that's too rough because look at California. It's obviously blue, but there are plenty of eastern counties or counties up north that are red. They're stuck, right? So blueprint number two might be to drill down one level to congressional districts and say, let's look at the congressional district and assign districts to red land and blue land based on that. That gets it a little bit closer to the average person's political view, but you make a much more complicated country, right? Now the map's starting to look pretty complicated. The next level down would be by counties, right? Where you take there's like 5,500 counties in America, and you say which ones are Republican dominated, which ones are Democrat, and then sort them into red land and blue land. There, you've got even closer to people's political preferences, but you've got a very complicated political map with islands, blue and red, particularly islands of blue within a sea of red. Blue land would now look very small. Red land would look huge, right? So you do that, but you still have plenty of people stranded in the wrong county, et cetera, right? Now, I don't know, what county is Fresno in?
It's Fresno County.
It's Fresno County.
Fresno City, Fresno County.
I don't know Fresno County well enough, but there's probably, I don't know, maybe somewhere it's middle ground, maybe something like that, right? So imagine that in a theoretical county where the polling shows about 48% Democrats, 48% Republicans, and 4% undecided.
Right.
And then in that same, constitutional convention, we'll call it a deconstitutional convention, right?
Nice.
They say, let's let the districts that are really tight have a vote. Let's let them vote which country they want to be in. Oh my goodness. Imagine how that'll play out. You're now going to get people are going to start really leaning into being red or leaning into being blue. They'll apply pressure on others. You get ideological hardening. And we know from work in political science that the middle becomes awfully quiet and awfully deserted in those moments of ideological hardening.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so now counties are going to shift one way or the other, right? But a lot of people are going to be pressured, right? You might get people who are kind of pressured to get the hell out of here. Get out of Fresno County, go over to San Francisco or go to Nevada, whatever it is. You get people pushing others, right? That's the polarization and ideological hardening. And then you'll start getting a process of unmixing where either people say, I don't like it here. I can see where the county is leaning. I'm going to move. Look, and there's a lot of people in the country who feel strongly about these things and they're armed. You have militias. We know all about this. You can easily get people in that context where the country is dissolving and trying to work through how it's going to be ordered, beginning to pressure people through threats or at the point of a gun to get out of this county and go over there. So you start getting an unmixing process. And if that happens, you start creating security dilemmas where you've got populations that are vulnerable. And if one starts shooting at another, you start get recriminations back and forth, which feeds back into the ideological hardening, right? I mean, so again, I take a chapter and I just walk through these parallels that are sequenced in terms of how they interact with one another. Then imagine the leaders, the emerging leaders, who, by the way, are going to be fragmented, right? It's not the case that if red land is easily going to be under the control of Donald Trump and blue land will be led cleanly by Joe Biden. It's going to, imagine blue land by Joe Biden. Do we think that Gavin Newsom is going to be fully on board with that? I'm not so sure, right? These things are going to get complicated. And then you're going to have leaders thinking, well, wait a second. It might behoove us to send in some militia or requisition military Georgia is on the fence in terms of red blue. There's the great blue dot of Atlanta. You can imagine red forces saying, if we could just reduce that blue dot a little bit, in the case of a vote, we're going to look a lot better. All these problems, and I'm really just go.
No, that's what the show's about. We want the deep dive.
Yeah.
We want the deep dive.
And falling from all of that, just all of that turmoil, and then you're going to get populations on the run. The United States would have an internal refugee problem following from that kind of attempt at unmixing. And so again, a big portion of the book is walking through, let's take the project of taking this seriously. How would you do this? And then all of the problems that would follow from it.
Just to back you up so that everybody watching, this is a congressional election district. And I think what the professor's saying is we're used to state boundaries. That all goes away. If people say, let's split up by congressional districts, it's each map, these lines match nothing. They're not even based upon rivers or national geographic boundaries. They're just all over the place. It'd be a totally scattershot map. And then I think you're saying if you go into county level, wow, every single inch of every single part of a state border would change. And you'd have disputes every, I don't know, mile or 10 miles of how this land. It wouldn't cleanly separate because we wouldn't be doing a clean state break. Not necessarily. We might be looking at counties or congressional districts, in which case things get massively complicated. Is that fair?
That is correct. Yeah. I mean, so this is congressional districts. I call this blueprint number 2. I forget the exact number, 500 odd congressional districts, right?
Right.
The next level down would be counties. There's about 5,500 of those. That's not the exact number, but something like that. So it's even smaller. It's more granular, right? In blue and red. And trying to create that map, not only, it creates lots of islands of blue within red and some islands of red within blue. And that makes for a very difficult national border between the countries. It's very difficult to work out that process, particularly if you have people shooting at one another, right?
As I understand, yeah, it makes it difficult to hold elections. There was a place called Bosnia.
Yeah.
And this is a county map for everybody. So you can see, my God, there's 30 or 40 counties for most states. If you actually started breaking it up into counties, I mean, you'd be doing this debate of borders for years. Yeah. It looks like, to actually figure out. And we don't know what the dividing line is. Maybe it would be states, maybe. But like you said,
and one way to think about it too, Marcus, is even if we went with Blueprint 3, which is the county one, right? That still doesn't put everybody in the place they want to be, right? Because again, there are couples, right, within households who disagree on these issues. So the way to make it perfect for every individual is to let them decide, but that's impossible. You wouldn't be able to create a coherent country because it wouldn't work. You would have to overlay the two countries on top of one another, right? There is no perfect blueprint. The bigger and more rational the map, the more people are going to be be a minority in a place that they perhaps don't want to be, right? So there's a trade-off between we'll call it the rationality of the map and how many people get to live in the country they want to live in.
Left behind enemy lines, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we covered that. Like, what are the top 3 things that they're missing? How do we make people? How are we going to draw the borders, and how do we do all that with making people not miserable? What's the other big pitfall besides how are you going to draw these borders that you think a lot of people, when they are initially attracted to this, let's just split up America and that's the way to solve division, that they're missing? Yeah. I can see, but another big one that you think most Americans are missing, in your opinion?
Sure. I think another big one, and this isn't just Americans, I think this is just people in general, is how you then become a recognized state, right? How did the two, so again, let's say I'm married. Let's say my wife and I got divorced, right? There are rules about there are laws about how we need to divide our estate. And if I grab the car and the kids and take off, then, my wife can call in the police and say, hey, look, he ran out, etc. There are no rules, right? There's nobody out there to govern the division of assets for the United States. Okay. Think about all its diplomatic embassies and consulates abroad, its membership in key organizations, all of its military hardware and bases around the world. So just to give you one very simple example, the United States, every recognized country has an international legal personality. The United States has that. And that gives it access to all kinds of things. And one example is a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Right. That is, talk about, that's the P5, right? That's China, the United States, Russia, France, and United Kingdom, right? Those countries can veto so many things in world politics, including recognizing new countries, right? Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, right, it was a P5 member, and Russia, as the core of the country, held on to that identity. It's as though Russia said, hey, the country's dissolving, but we are the primary unit in this country, so we're going to keep that identity. We're going to remain on the Security Council as a permanent member. That's what Russia did, okay? Now, sometimes when countries dissolve, they don't keep their identity. So when Czechoslovakia divided, right? Neither country kept the permanent identity. Both had to then reapply to the United Nations, all right? So sometimes I had a conversation just the other day with somebody who's a proponent of red state Americas separating, and they said, well, blue land and red land can just divide like Czechoslovakia, right? Well, maybe. But what that means then is that both countries will forfeit that position on the UN Security Council. Then red land and blue land would then have to reapply to the United Nations, seek recognition around the world, and that P5 of all powerful states of the UN would now be the P4. And boy, I imagine China and Russia would be pretty excited to not have the United States on that council anymore as a permanent member, right? You give up a lot. But let's say that, things don't go so, it's not such an amiable divorce, then the default rule might be that whoever retains the national capital, Washington, D.C., might be able to say, well, we are going to keep that legal identity, and the other will be treated as the seceding unit. That's likely blue land. Washington, D.C. might, likely, best guess, if I'm a betting man, I'm not, but if I was, I'd say blue land will get Washington, D.C. They'll say, a newly emerging Joe Biden, president of, might say, we keep that identity. We're a permanent member. Is Redland going to accept that? Are they going to say, oh, wait a second, that's fine. You keep all the assets, all the
right
you have in all these organizations around the world, all those embassies and consulates, we'll start anew. We'll apply to the United Nations as a member, and you can veto us, apparently, because those are the rules, right? I'm not sure that divorce is going to work out so swimmingly, all right? And that's just one example of all of the attendant issues that follow from trying to join the international community. It's complicated. It's difficult. Think about national debt, right? As a quick example, on the run up to the 2014 Scottish referendum on independence,
right?
I was there. I was tracking it. And I have to compliment the Scots. You had these amazing debates on the streets. They were civil. They were great. But nevertheless, you had people who were pro-independence saying, well, if we become independent, no problem. We'll join the EU or we'll stay on the pound. Our pensions will still be managed by the British economy. We'll get the North Sea oil. Medicare will still be on the British system. No problem. Right. And then on the other side, the British government was saying, where did you get that idea? Do you think that you're not going to have to take some of the debt, that North Sea oil is yours, that you can remain on our pension and the pound? None of those things were worked out, right? So voters have to, they're basically voting on a bunch of unknown things. And that's what referenda do. It's not like exactly the consequences of what you're voting on. You really don't. There's a lot of emotion and a lot of uncertainty on it. So point being is just that there's a lot of uncertainty about how these processes work. And I think that it's not that people are uninformed in America. It's just that people don't think about these things.
Right.
But see them in other countries. And if you take the lessons learned there and apply them in the United States, there are all these pitfalls that'll follow from it that make for a much more acrimonious attempt at trying to divide into two.
Right. And just to back up what you're saying, Czechoslovakia broke up. It was messy. When the Soviet Union broke up, I heard it was largely peaceful, but that's because it broke up into pre-existing states. They had already been independent states before, so they didn't have the congressional district or county district debate. They knew this was originally historically Latvia, this was historically Ukraine. They didn't have to go, well, you have a congressional district in Ukraine that we want to add to Russia now. And they didn't do that. They just stayed.
Yeah. That's probably right. Although Czechoslovakia wasn't messy. That was clean. It was the so-called velvet divorce. Yugoslavia was a very messy.
There you go. Sorry.
So
That's
the three countries all kind of did the same thing at the same time. And they attempted to divide into their constituent units, right? Which are kind of like the 50 states in a sense. Although each of those constituent units had more, they were in theory given to specific nations within those countries, whereas the 50 core states of America don't have the same kind of administrative status. But that is right. But even in the case of the Soviet Union, right, they divided into I think it's the 17 core republics. But that still left lots of population stranded within, new emerging countries they didn't want to be a part of. And you can see this in the, Nagorno-Karabakh ended up.
I was just going to say. And
that was
we have a huge Armenian population here in Fresno.
Yeah. Oh, right. And that's a very active population. And I'm sure a lot of them were despaired last year when Nagorno-Karabakh was militarily reconquered by Azerbaijan. And that's a legacy of how the Soviet Union split.
Yeah, they were pretty upset about that. They view it as their land going back thousands of years or whatever. And they felt Russia double-crossed them.
Yeah.
That's so. I do want to bring up that, yes, if you have the country break up into two nations, you're right, it could go down to the counties, to congressional districts. I did want to bring up, though, that when they talk about an individual state seceding, I've heard about, well, if Texas breaks off, people could break off within Texas. My understanding is that legally can't happen because counties are not recognized by the federal government. The federal government only recognizes states. That goes back to the Constitution. So there's no governmental body to petition the federal government for splitting. However, if you had this national divorce, it's a totally different construct. So what's the solution? How do we get people to calm down? It sounds like you're saying, hey, a full national divorce isn't going to work like you guys think it is. It's going to be a lot messier. You probably haven't thought about all the pitfalls. Theoretically, you could figure them out, but given how complex they are and you're not even really aware of these things, probably not. How do we get, what's the goal of the book and how does that make America better?
Yeah. That's a good, it's a good question. And I'm not going to have a great answer for that. Right. But
that's fine.
But let me lead in with one little comment that came out of a conversation I had a couple of days ago with, again, with an individual active on the red state side. And it's a very fruitful conversation. And they said, they made the argument that, that what I'm doing in the book could be dangerous for a very simple reason, that by saying that secession is not going to work, what I'm doing is signaling to individuals out there and individuals in the sense that they are kind of armed militia, and given the context of the conversation, right-wing militia, who will then conclude, well, if secession's off the table, we have no choice but to resort to violence. So by making the argument in the book, I'm increasing the conditions, the possibility for violence. Okay. And I have to be clear here as an aside, I've thought a lot about ethical issues when working through this. I always do with secessionist movements because they're very real things. But my response to this is that I think that argument is flipped on its head. I think it's reversed. I think the point of the book is to say that secession is really not a very possible thing. I mean, of course it could happen, but it would only happen in very extreme, difficult, and violent destructive circumstances. And to know that should push a lot of individuals to realize that if that's not really an option, then seeking common ground, seeking solutions to disagreement, good old fashioned. And here I'm going to channel your 9th grade civics teacher, right? Americans coming together to work through their issues is the right solution, because secession doesn't work, right? And in fact, if you thought that secession was the solution and you really push for it, well, let's just go divide into America, that is more likely to create violence, right? So by trying to say that this is a dangerous program, right, and then push the conversation back to saying, look, you've got people with very polarized views, disagreements. The best thing, you're kind of stuck together in a sense. The best thing you can do is, try to work through common solutions to seek out a common ground, right? And I don't spend a lot of time in the book going through those solutions, because those are things that, you are just as familiar with as I am, maybe even more familiar. You can think of different policy ideas about, getting away from voting districts that are gerrymandered and create ideologically radical constituencies, Supreme Court, term limits, all kinds of things that, like if you go through the top 5 things political scientists suggest for reducing polarization, there are the greatest hits right there. Go through all those things, right? But again, those aren't things that I spend a lot of time in the book, because, other people make those arguments better. My point is to say that if you think that this is a solution, you shouldn't really see it as a very good solution. It's very dangerous, and therefore redirect your attention back to the point of seeking common ground, right? And look, I'll be honest too, Marcus, I haven't written the conclusion yet, but I intend to. The book is nonpartisan. It's a little patriotic, and I'm not bullshit. I'm not BSing there. Like, I really make a pitch to how I feel about this issue, which is, look, fairly moderate person politically, who has lived in California, who's lived in Nebraska and Florida and New York, and sees, I see fellow Americans in all those places. And so a common ground approach is ultimately not only the best solution, in my opinion, but potentially the only real solution.
I like it. I don't. The idea if the book causes violence, I think, is a irrelevant point. In America, in the West, we decided, I guess, after World War II, that it would be better for us to have these conversations and read books and debate things, and not say that idea is bad, let's keep it away from the public. We said that that's what the Nazis do, and the communist Chinese and the communist Soviets, and maybe it does keep peace in their population for a little bit, but we said that that's not progress. And as we look over history, democracy is more stable than any of those other systems long term, although we do have problems, 1960s, Civil War, etc. But we tend to stay together over the long picture than not. So I view their point as moot. This is what we do in this country, what we should be doing, discussing. I don't think that's a good idea. Here's my reasons. If you disagree with me, write your own book. Let's keep the discussion going. That's my feeling, is that you're going to cause violence by causing a discussion. No, not my fault. Reason, unless I'm saying my book's about how war is the solution. I mean, no one's saying that. So, it's like, oh, Socrates, how dare you have a conversation between these ancient Greeks? Someone could get mad. That's life, as we do in the Western order. Okay. I'm going to load. This is one of the last questions. This is going to be a little tricky. I'm warning you ahead of time. But you had mentioned that you felt that polarization is a real thing. It's kind of bad in America. That's not a big surprise. We have the highest rate of the filibuster being used in the Senate in history, the highest rate of cloture, which is where they shut down the debate and force an immediate vote in the last century, the least productive Congress in 50 years, a Congress that passes the least amount of laws in 60 years, is the most divisive in 100 years, and they're now passing the least amount of joint legislation where you'd have people from different parties tag team and support a legislation. So across the board, the metrics are the worst they've been in half a century. Why is that an option for bringing us together? I mean, people are looking at this and going, wow, the system is not working. There's hard metrics showing that we are doing the worst we've done in 50 years. Why is that the solution instead?
Well, I mean, so the solution being trying to work through your issues, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, go like in the article, go back to the Constitution, go to Congress, try to reach out, work on. So couldn't a critic say, man, I've been doing it, it's not working? And have you seen the stats? We're the worst we've been at that in half a century.
Yeah.
Why have faith?
Yeah, I mean, well, because I guess for a couple of reasons, right? There's that thing. It's a kind of an unquantifiable, which is how each individual sees that and concludes whether or not it's broken or kind of great,
right,
right. So I accept. I mean, I won't quibble with the the stats that the period of polarization is the worst it's been in my life. I'm not super old, but whatever. That it's bad, right?
Okay.
But 2 points on that, right? I mean, in many ways, the United States still functions as, I look outside, it's a functional society. It's a good way of life relative to other societies in the world. Not all societies, people will trot out Denmark and say, look at them. But
yeah, I get it. Right.
Yeah. But it's still a functional society. It's doing well, et cetera. The economy is still growing. There are problems. There's no question. And, whether the problems writ large are worse than earlier decades is kind of depends on what you stress, but polarization is certainly worse. And it gets in the way of proper policy making. There are all sorts of issues that could be worked through much more effectively if you didn't have the polarization. Or as you pointed out, you had a lot more bipartisan deal making and consensus, no question. But it's so I guess 2 answers. One is still a very functional society. I would have to see it as my regular way of life is not working for me to conclude otherwise. And then there's also, there are the rhythms of polarization, right? It's not like it's a one-way conveyor belt, or I should go down, right, to a bad place. It can cycle. And we know that there are these cycles through U.S. political history. Different things begin to reconcile it, partly because of, parties change, there's realignments, things like that. Media changes, new rules are in place, all these things. And it's a complicated thing. So I guess 2 points. One is still a functional society, highly functional, actually, but far from perfect. There's no question, right? And second, it's not clear to me that this is a runaway train, right? That it can't be changed, and we just don't know.
That's fair. I would add though that I remember when Marjorie Taylor Greene made her famous tweet about we need a national divorce. 30 different newspapers picked up this one article, and basically they interviewed a governor from Utah who said, "Oh, Marjorie, you idiot. We don't need a national divorce. We need national marriage counseling."
Yeah, right.
That was never defined. That was just given. Yeah. And I was told Joe Biden was the person that we voted for to return the soul of America. That was literally the phrase they used in the 2020 election. He would be, quotes, the return to decency, and quotes, there would be a, quote, national calming that would happen when he was there, where Republicans and MAGA people would learn, oh, we were wrong, and we need to give up our ways. And Joe Biden would bring them all together. That's totally failed. So if Biden was the one that was the national election and bring us together in the soul of America, and he completely failed, who does the marriage counseling now, Professor?
It's a good question. And Marcus, I do not have an answer for that. There's no
sorry.
There's nobody in the U.S. political firmament. I'm trying to think.
AOC?
No. Nobody that I see. There's no politician out there that I think that is the person who can bridge the divide, right? They may be out there, and it may just be my own sort of ignorance, not following closely enough all the different people. But I mean, look, I think I'm concerned about current leadership. Yes, and I think a generational change would help. And most people think that, unless you happen to be maybe 80 years old or something. But I mean, I'm not a young guy, but I'm far, far younger than our current candidates. I think that would
yeah.
But so long story short, I don't have a good answer for you. And I wish there was that person, that could do it. Who came to mind, but this is a joke, really. I thought of Stephen Colbert because I think he's very funny.
Stephen Colbert, yeah.
But obviously he's not running for president.
So Ted Cruz wouldn't be maybe a best candidate. No.
You're
squad. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Trump.
Yeah, there's nobody. There's not a. The parties are at a point right now. Some new leadership would help.
We need Mr. Smith from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to come to life. Yeah. Go back to Washington and give us that great speech at the end of the movie where he's, this is democracy. But
on that too, I think it's going to take more than just good leadership, right? Leaders can only do so much. I think there are structural features that are problematic, some of which can be altered. The position of the parties right now, I think, is problematic, right? I think the parties were kind of due for a bit of a realignment, and I think that would really help. I think the media sphere, look, I'm not saying anything that that's going to shock people, but I think the media sphere is also unhelpful.
So, yeah, I've heard that the media is not helping, and there are some structural changes that I've heard that Newt Gingrich in the 1990s made a lot of changes to the way that Congress worked, and that we're dealing with the repercussions of that we had a workable system, and he started changing things. For example, he told people, stay in your home district, don't stay in DC, keep your family in your home district, don't have them here, spend more of the week in your home district. Not hearing what that did was you had this culture of people would live together. They may yell at each other on TV, but at the end of the day, their kids went to the same school. Their wives knew each other. They'd have dinner. They'd have drinks. They'd go you couldn't avoid it. Now that's gone. He wiped that out. That's just a theory. I heard that. Okay, final thoughts. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this. Boy, did they learn a lot. But they're struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing the professor said, and they can't get out of their head. It's 5 days after watching this interview, and they go, there was so much material, it's working back, but the professor really summarized and synced it down to one massive conclusion point, and I just can't get that out of my head. What is that thought, Professor?
I would say that the idea that we can divide the United States into two countries, a red land and a blue land, a red state America and a blue state America, is a mirage, right? To be able to do that, you would only be successful after a tremendous amount of violence and just a huge disruption of society. Therefore, the best thing to do is to put that aside as a solution, red state, blue state, and think instead about trying to find common ground and, listening to opposing points of view, having conversations, and trying to think through this as one country.
I consider myself a liberal. I'm from California. I'm from the conservative part, but I'm from California. And I spend a lot of time talking to conservatives around the country, and I routinely hear I'm one of the very few doing it. I salute your work, and I absolutely agree. If we could, just because you're talking to somebody who's on the other side doesn't mean you have to automatically agree with them. You just have a conversation. I think we've forgotten that point. And we've kind of turned to, well, if I'm talking with you, that means I agree. No, it doesn't. We can have just debates. Okay, we'll leave it there. I'll send you a copy of the video. I do want to ask you one thing. Just think about it. You don't have to, but we always ask for recommendations to keep the conversation going. If you know any activist professor, anybody who wants to have an honest conversation about political polarization, you can tell me in the email or not, whatever. I'll email you a little bit later and we'll leave it there. And I want to thank you for your time. This was another great in-depth interview with a lot of material that I don't see the media covering this in this depth. That's partly why I started this series. It's what I see is Republicans are all racist. Therefore, they caused the whole problem. Social media, Facebook made this happen to us. Okay. I'm like, that's like that's a high school level presentation of what's going on. Maybe that's true, but we need more depth. And I appreciate you being part of this.
All right. Well, thank you, Marcus. I hope it was helpful. And hey, look, thank you again. It's always a pleasure having this conversation with you.
I'll email you soon. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.